This is a quick review of the life of Mont and Imogene Sorensen. On December 25, 1919, Harriet Bowers Sorensen delivered a very small son with the help of her midwife mother, Harriet Bowers. He was placed in a warming oven to keep him warm. His name was Mont. When asked why such a short name, she said that such a small baby needed a short name. As with many of the Sorensen children, there has been some confusion as to his full name. Some records were Mont, others were Monty, and in one or two, Mont B. and Monty Bowers Sorensen. In later years, after searching official records, it was determined his name was officially Mont Sorensen. Mont liked to spend the summers on the ranch, where he learned to love dogs, cattle, horses, and dislike sheep. The family adopted a fawn when Mont was about 2 years old that loved to suck on his ears, but Mont didn't seem to mind. Mont liked to stay at the ranch with Grandpa Benny when Grandma Harriet and the other kids stayed in Orderville, because Mont was not yet in school. On a weekly basis, Grandpa Benny would lift Mont onto a horse and send him into town with the cream. He would ride one horse and lead the other, which had 5 gallons of cream tied on each side. When he got to town, he would call out, and Grandma Harriet would help him off the horse and get the cream down. He was sure glad the horse knew the way. When Mont was in elementary school, he had Miss Peterson for a teacher. One day, Ariel Chamberlain roped her and they were going to tie her to a tree, but she cut the rope in two with a knife. Since this didn't work, Mont tells us, we decided to whip her. We drew lots to see who was going to do it. Smokey DeMille did the honors. He went sneaking around behind the building and grabbed her. She swung around and hit Smokey in the head with her hand, and the next thing Smokey knew, he hit the ground. That was the end of our plans. The fall Mont was a freshman. He trailed 500 head of sheep to Cedar City. He left the ranch with a horse and a blanket. He was gone for 2 nights alone. One night he woke up and the sheep were gone. He could barely hear the bells up the canyon, so he got up, packed the horse, and took after the sheep. As he started down the canyon, he finally caught up with him. Grandpa Benny met him the next night just before they got to the stockyards in Cedar. He often said that he herded sheep all the time he was growing up, which seemed to be most of his life. He often referred to sheep as mountain maggots, or they were a bag of bones looking for a place to die. When Mont was in junior high school, Miss Martin was teaching history. The room had some big, tall maps hanging from the ceiling. One day he got behind the maps and made everyone laugh as he stuck his head out from behind them and would make a face. One time as he stuck his head out, she saw him and slapped him right across the face and bloodied his nose. Mont said he went outside with his bloodied nose and she followed him crying because she had been so mean. She should have hit me again, he said, as I had it coming. Mont started playing basketball when he was a freshman in high school. He was so small that he could slip away from the guards and score. He played basketball all 4 years, and when he was a senior, they won their division. After graduation, Mont herded sheep again. It was late in the fall, and it was Mont's turn to take the sheep to water. The path to water needed to go near the cabin of a grumpy old man. All the boys had told Mont how mean this guy was. Mont got his gun and headed up with the sheep. He stopped along the way to shoot some rabbits, and when he got back, the sheep were gone. He looked and finally saw the sheep going right down across the yard of that old man's cabin. He sent his dog down after the sheep, and the dog turned the sheep back, but they only moved about 150 yards from his door. Then they all stopped and laid down. Mont was scared, but he knew he had to go after them. He said, I was afraid to take my gun because I didn't want him to think I was looking for trouble, so I put my gun down and headed down the hill. I was almost to the sheep when here came the guy. He was about 6 feet, 6 inches tall and rode a little mule. He was the biggest man I had ever seen. He came over and talked and visited with me and didn't act like he was mad. I wanted to get away from there so badly, but he invited me to dinner, and not wanting to argue, I went with him. After dinner, he showed me his cow and told me how he took care of it. He told me he wanted to go to town, and if I would take care of his cow, he would return in 3 to 4 days. I told him I would. Mont continued. The sheep finally started to move, but in the opposite direction from where I left my gun. I hated to leave my gun, and I hated to lose the sheep, and I hated to follow the sheep and leave my gun. But finally I started after the sheep because I wanted to get them back to camp. The fellow said, "Why don't you just go get your gun, and I will turn your sheep back towards your camp." I didn't know what to say, so I started for my gun and he turned the sheep back. I took care of his cow, and when he came back from town, he brought me a sack of candy. I had made a friend. In September 1942, Mont was drafted into the Army and inducted at Fort Douglas, Utah, and from there went to Victorville, California for 2 months of basic training. From there he was assigned to the 69th Division that went to France. He said in France they boarded the train to go to the front lines. We met a train coming back from the fighting, and it had bodies stacked on it just like logs. This was the first time I realized there was really a war going on. From there, he went across Europe and landed in Leipzig, Germany. One night we were dug in near a river when someone from headquarters came looking for Mont Sorensen. Mont continued. I went with him, and that evening we were assigned to cross the river to find a place where the troops could land on the other side. They took us in a jeep upstream about a quarter of a mile, gave us some inner tubes, and at dark we floated across the river. We started inland and heard the Germans speaking. I laid flat on the ground until I heard them move away and then worked my way back to the tubes. It seemed like hours before my companions returned. We took the tubes and floated down the river in the rain. We landed way below camp, so we had to walk up a cobblestone road. On the way back, we were soaked and freezing, and I asked him why I was so lucky to get this assignment. The captain told me it was because I was a Mormon, and Mormons, he said, always come back safely. It seemed to always be cold, so the GIs would go to warm places like skating rinks. Mont bought a new pair of skates and tried skating. He went about 25 feet, fell down 5 times, went back to the bench, took off the skates and threw them under the bench and went to the movie theater. He said the movie was a repeat, but it was warm and he didn't fall down. He just had to worry about waking up to go on duty. Mont's company came across a captured German medical group. They were very unwilling to give any information. Mont took a chain away from one of the nurses. It must have been a very special chain to her because she really screamed and fought. It was war and emotions were very different. Mont mentioned later that he was sorry about taking the necklace, but it took him 20 years. On the lighter side, Mont told of a time near the Belgium border they were doing lots of trading with the Frenchmen. Anything you had, they would trade something for it. He said if you didn't watch those guys, they would take what you had and run off, and if you went after them, others would stand in your way so you couldn't catch them. I was trading this Frenchman a blanket, and we were having quite a struggle making a trade. For protection, I had tied my end of the blanket to the train seat. The way you traded was when you agreed, you grabbed your stuff out of their hands before they could run off. The train started to move, and so we decided to make the trade. I let go of the blanket and grabbed what I was getting, which was a ring and a little statue, really just a bunch of junk. I gave him the blanket but forgot that I had tied it to the train seat, and the train started moving, and instead of stopping, it gained speed. He hung on so tight I couldn't get it untied. He held on as long as he could, and the last I saw of him he was on the platform shaking his fist at me. Mont returned to Orderville in March of 1946. Again herded sheep and then went to farming with his dad. He used his GI Bill to take some agricultural classes. He cut cedar posts to help supplement the GI money. Mont was sort of the gang leader around town and the one people would check with to find out what was going on. One day after he had been home for about a year, he went down to his brother Burke's cafe. He had a new girl working for him. Mont said she was the prettiest girl I had ever seen. Her name was Imogene Baldwin. Later, Shirley Esplin, Mont's cousin, came into Imogene's room and asked if she would like to go for a ride with Mont and Sharon Lamb. Having nothing better to do, Imogene went. On the way out, Mont and Shirley rode in the back seat, and Imogene and Sharon sat in the front. On the way home, Mont and Imogene got the back seat. The next morning, when Mont came down to the cafe for his coffee, he asked Imogene out for that night. A few weeks later, there was a dance at Three Lakes. Mont was a little slow in asking Jean to go, so she went with someone else. He still danced with her more than once, and Mont said it was the last time he gave the other guy half a chance. He also started meeting her each night to walk her home from the cafe, even though her room was just across the street. Mont went out with Imogene a couple of times that summer of 1947, and in the fall went back to herding sheep, and she went back to Dixie College. The following summer, they started going steady, and in December of 1949, they were married in the St. George LDS Temple. He said, "It took her a long time to reform me so that I could take her to the temple. I suggested several times that we elope, but she hung out for a temple marriage, and I love her much more for that because I know I wanted her to be my eternal companion." Mont and Imogene had their reception in Orderville. It was popular to charivari, or take the bride or groom and leave them somewhere outside of town. Mont was determined not to get chivarried, so he got the elementary school janitor to let them escape through the girls' restroom window and then unlock the grade school building where they hid. Mont and Jean stayed there until 2 or 3 a.m., and then when everyone was gone, they walked to their apartment. Mont said he wasn't about to let them get hold of him, as he would probably end up in Panguitch. Mont and Jean lived on the ranch for a couple of years, farming and cutting posts. It was soon evident that the ranch could not support 2 families, so Mont applied for a job at Iron Mountain Mine near Cedar City. They could not find a place to live in Cedar, so they moved to Newcastle. Mont had been working at the mine about 18 months when a cable broke and hit him on the right side of the head, throwing a piece of wire about 3/4 of an inch into his right eye. After many trips to Salt Lake, the doctors were able to save some sight in that eye, but he wore a dark glass over it the rest of his life. Mont had dropped into church inactivity after the move to Newcastle. When Veldon was about 3, Jean was getting him ready for church when he announced that if Daddy didn't have to go to church, neither did he. Mont resumed activity in the church when he was asked to be the ward clerk. A few years later, he was called to be the bishop of the Newcastle ward. In order to coax the men he selected as counselors into being interviewed, he told them he had a sick cow and he needed their help. When they were in the car and couldn't get away, he told them what he really needed. Imogene said they were the only 2 men in the ward that believed that Mont could be the bishop. Mont was given the assignment to heal the ward from a rift and build a new chapel. He started by taking our little farm tractor down to the churchyard every night after work, and we started cutting down the trees that needed to be removed. The only tool he had was an axe. He would chop a tree down, then hook onto it with a tractor and pull it to the back of the church property so that in a few months it could be burnt. The first day it was just our family. We had fun riding on the trees after they were down as Dad pulled them. Soon kids from the neighborhood showed up to ride on the trees. Eventually every kid in town was riding on the branches as Mont pulled the trees to the burn pile. Soon the whole ward was there each night, and Mont's full-time job was to hook onto the trees and drag them to be burnt. One day the tractor stopped and someone asked what the problem was, and Mont replied that little tractor just couldn't pull that many kids. In 1963, Mont and Jean and family packed up the little farm tractor, their household items, a Rambler, an old Chevy pickup, and moved to a 600-acre farm in Dietrich, Idaho. The farm kept everyone working. Kay once asked, "Why are we poor?" Mont's reply was, "We're not poor, we just don't have any money." At Dietrich, the family milked cows, fed calves, grew row crops, and raised beef cattle. A few family favorite stories about living on the farm. One day, Ron recalled that he and Kay were trying to catch a week-old calf. We were each on a horse and had thrown a rope 8 to 10 times. Dad came up and was upset that the calf was foaming at the mouth from running. Dad got on the horse that Ron was riding and went after the calf. Dad threw one time and caught the calf. Right then, Ron decided that if a 55-year-old man who was blind in one eye and riding a rope-shy horse could catch a range calf with one throw, he'd better stay off the horse and ride a tractor. Mont hated ladders and was never a fan of heights. He was, however, quick on his feet, but he could never beat Ron in a foot race. One day Ron said, "We were picking rock and we were struggling together to lift a flat rock that had served as a fence corner post. We finally got it up on edge when we heard a rattling sound. We looked down and saw a nest of rattlesnakes under it. We dropped that rock and started running. Ron said all I saw was the back of Dad's head as we ran across the field." Mont had a very simple approach to parenting, and that was the use of natural consequences. For example, when Veldon asked what his curfew was when he started dating, Mont replied, "You choose, but you still have to milk at 5:30. Hauling hay was always an adventure. Kay remembers rolling hay bales into a line to be picked up with a loader. He turned over a bale that had a snake sticking out of it where it had gone through the baler. Kay said, "I hurried the bale over to the row that Dad was going to pick up next and went back to rolling bales. To get the bales off the loader, we had a hay hook about 2 feet long, and we would reach out and pull the bale with the hook and let the bales fall down onto our thighs, grab the strings to stack them. I sat down and watched as Dad got to the bale. He grabbed the bale with a hook and pulled. That dead snake flipped up and must have looked him right in the eye. Dad couldn't get away fast enough. He jerked back so hard he broke the bale strings, and loose hay fell to the floor of the wagon. Realizing there was a snake on the floor, he began kicking the hay for all he was worth. Hay was flying in all directions, and Dad looked like a Russian dancer. I laughed, and when Dad suddenly realized what had happened, he looked over at me and shook the hay hook and yelled, 'Damn you, that's not funny.' Yes, it was." Mont served in the bishopric of the Dietrich ward. Bishop Roy Hubert told that one Sunday morning he was driving to their bishopric meeting when he saw Shirley Kelly, one of Mont's neighbors, trying to release a goat that was caught in some barbed wire. Roy said, "I knew I should stop, but I had a church meeting to attend, so I waved and went on to my meeting." A few minutes later, Mont came by, saw Shirley struggling with the goat, and stopped to see if he could help. Quickly assessing that the goat could not be saved, Mont went home, changed his clothes, came back, helped Shirley get the goat out of the wire, butcher it, returned home, changed his clothes, and went to the meeting. When Mont arrived very late at the meeting, Roy continued, "I was a bit harsh with him and told him that these meetings were important and he needed to be here on time. I asked Mont if he knew what time the meeting was to start. Mont said that he did, and the meeting went on. The next day at work, Shirley, who was a clerk at the bank where Roy was the manager, said that she sure appreciated Mont stopping and helping. Mont assured her that nothing was more important than she was. Roy concluded that was Mont. He continued, "I have used that example many times about knowing and setting your personal priorities and the difference between knowing the gospel and living the gospel." No one got more enjoyment from children than Mont. He rarely went to a meeting that he didn't find some child that needed loving arms or his ever-present lifesavers. On October 23, 1980, Mont was helping a neighbor who was having trouble with his corn chopper. Mont was concerned about him and agreed to finish chopping his corn. Knowing that the neighbor couldn't pay, Mont said he would take a load of corn as payment. He had just brought in the last load to her silage pit when the tractor slid off the edge on his blind side, throwing him against the steering wheel, which killed him instantly. Mont's funeral was held in Shoshone, Idaho. The chapel and overflow were both filled to capacity. Interestingly, most of the attendees came in overalls and work clothes, as many heard of his death the day of the funeral and came regardless of their dress just to pay their respects. Mont was buried in his hometown of Orderville, Utah. Imogene ran the farm for a number of years. She then sold the farm and moved to McCammon, Idaho, where she was living with Janelle, and has moved several times, including stops in Nevada, Shelley, American Falls, and Idaho Falls, Idaho. She is now living in the Williamsburg Assisted Living Facility in Logan, Utah. Imogene has been the glue that has held her family together since Mont's death. Her strength and example is no less valued or admired by those who know her. The blood of those brave souls who came before us runs no less strong in her veins than in Mont's. We honor her today as we do Mont. Imogene and Mont had 4 children, Veldon, Kay, Janelle, and Ron. Veldon and Diane live in Mill Creek, Utah, and have 4 children. Amy is married to Colin Sturt, and they have 3 living children and twins that passed away at birth. Audrey is married to Joshua Walker, and they have 3 children. Monty is married to Heidi Levitt, and they have 2 children with one on the way. Scott is married to Laura Gailey, and they have one on the way. Kay and Sandra live in Twin Falls, Idaho, and have 3 children. Emily lives in Twin Falls and has 4 children. Becky is married to Lance Waltman, and they have 6 children. Colin is married to Whitney Richardson, and they have 2 children. Janelle and Eugene, who is deceased, live in Idaho Falls and have 4 children. Heather lives in Boise, Idaho. Dan is married to Julie Dotson, and they have 3 children. Ian is married to Ashley Mace, and they keep 3 dogs. Lamont is married to Cherise Boyton, and they have 3 children. Ron is married to Melanie Johnson, and they live in Leesburg, Georgia, and have 5 children. Shannon is married to Leland Harrelson, and they have 3 children. Dylan is married to Renee Davis, and they have 4 children. Trina is married to Elijah Hall, and they have 2 children. Nathan is married to Bethy Willen, and they have 1 child. Val is married to Chelsea Battle, and they have 2 children. This is the last photo that we have of Dad. He was a very young 61 years at the time of his death. He is pictured with Imogene and 2 of his grandchildren, Amy and Audrey, at Veldon and Diane's home in Kimberly, Idaho, in September of 1980.